So for those who don't know you, Gennaro does so. He's founder and CEO of Genetic Networks, which pioneers how drugs are mapped onto genetic modules to push forward the development of new treatments. I believe the ignition for Genetic Networks was Gennaro seeing the kind of limitations in the industry as to how we produce drugs. Before Genetic Networks, Gennaro spent 20 years researching the functional interactions between genes and the cell cycle. And of course, we are welcoming and we're very privileged to have Michael Casey. He is a journalist and author. I believe you've written 5 books. I kind of lost track. Everyone, you'll know him from CoinDesk, the Wall Street Journal, Dow Jones, and his focus is kind of on the social, economic, and political impact of tech. So, Michael, you are moderator, and I will hand it over to you.
Oh, I didn't even realize I was moderating. Sorry, guys.
Fireside chat. Fireside chat. Sorry.
Fireside chat. That sounds good. All right. Okay, Gennaro.
But before you go there, there are a couple of thoughts that I want to share, so that because I'm interested in this and particularly passionate about this area. So when we look at, when we met Gennaro a year ago, it was all about Pharma DAO, the DAO and Pharma. An idea was bringing medicine affordably to the majority of the population of the globe. On one scale. The second was the idea of being able to use existing drugs that have gone through FDA approvals and not having to re-engineer and wait for the process of approvals to create new drugs that would work together to solve illnesses. I think sometimes what we do forget is being in the US or North America or Canada or Europe is we're so used to having accessibility. And we have an insurance, if we have insurance that covers the drug, copay. If we don't have insurance, we're up shit creek dramatically. So we've got problems that exist here, different problems, but related in Europe. And then we've got emerging nations that have issues with not only identifying drugs that are available, but cannot access them because of cost, because of the way that the IP patents are structured on new drugs that prevent them from having it because of the massive costs to it. Yet, a lot of pharma companies are using developing nations or emerging nations to test out their drugs and have found veracity in that and compatibility. But yet we come back, use a patent in the US or America or Europe, and then restrict the affordability. So apart from all of the conversations that you and Michael are going to have, I'd like us to be able to actually investigate and think through whether drugs can be made accessible at an affordable price to the majority of the population. What are the challenges there with research, creation, and distribution? And then whether a DAO is actually the right formula to address this issue. DAOs, as we know it, have a problem. We still fall into the 85%, 15% rule, where the 15% are the governance and make all the decisions, and the 85 are dependent on those choices just because they're either too busy, tied up, or no longer interested in participating in the vote. So that is still, so there are challenges with the DAO structure, but I'd like for you guys to actually dive a little bit deep into that. Now, it's a lot to ask to be done in 35 minutes.
That was quite a bit.
Yeah, but I'll let you and Michael take it from here and jump in. I'll jump in when.
I've been known to do it in 15 minutes, but it's pretty hard. Well, go, Michael.
I think Karim can set the stage then. Like, why don't you just lay out the core problem that that with the business model, with the economy, if you like, of drug development that I think you've spent much time thinking about, and how we grapple with those problems, and then we can segue into the DAO after that. So
yeah, I think that's a really, really good way to start. So I could go back in part of my history was about, I think it was about 20 years ago, maybe a little less, 15 years ago, there was a decision by the Supreme Court to not allow patenting of genes. I was a researcher for actually more than 20 years in this area, and one of the things I kind of relied on in order to put my kids through college was my capability of finding genes that controlled the cell division cycle, which we did very well. And we had patents on these things and won a Nobel Prize for it, collectively, I would say. I mean, it was my boss that won it, but we were all part of that. And when they took that away, which you could argue whether it's good, bad, or otherwise, it really removed a huge incentive for research scientists to get somewhere higher than just being an academic. So I kind of started thinking about companies at that point, and it took me years before I came up with a good enough idea. But the principle is that we still discover targets of drugs with research, and that's where it starts. And that's $38 billion out of a Dow government treasury, the way I look at it. So the United States government only puts $38 billion a year into research every year. So it's about 1% of our treasury. I think of that as a Dow. And then you say, well, what do you get for that? Well, what you get from that is big pharma coming around and recognizing a target as being interesting. They don't have to worry about patents now. They don't have to license anything from a university, which they used to have to do. That's what created billion-dollar companies in the past. But that no longer is an option. I'm thinking of Myriad Genetics, for example, with BRCA, which was an amazing, discovery, and then it led to $1 billion enterprise, which still exists today. But that's gone now. So they just take that information and they might decide to develop a drug to that target. But in most cases, big pharma doesn't really do that. It's the biotech community that does that. And they do that in a very specific way. I'm not saying this is always the case, but it's largely the case. They will then spend around $1 billion investing in 10 companies that try to make drugs to these different targets that are discovered by the academics, typically. And then they, maybe 1 out of 10 works, maybe less than 1 out of 10. If 1 out of 10, you're doing great because you've invested, let's say, anywhere from $1 billion to $2 billion, but the going price for a phase 2 drug being sold to a big pharma is the $3 billion price tag. So even if you've spent $2 billion and 90% were bad investments, you still end up making $1 billion net on your, so it's quite extraordinary, that you can do that. But then when you really think about it, it's a highly inefficient system because you're really wasting a lot of resource to get one drug produced. And it has to be a new drug because it's the only thing that will be worth $3 billion when it's sold to a big pharma. And likewise, big pharma can then argue they spent $3 billion on this, so they have to charge us, the consumer, $5 billion a year for that drug to make it profitable for them and afford their large enterprise. So it's a system that continually gets more expensive just by, driving this system, which is very inefficient. So you end up with this problem. So
Gennaro, let's just hold you there for a second. I want to just lay this out, right? So, because you talk about the Supreme Court decision, and one of the things that's so striking about that is I would think, I do trust the highest court in the land, that the intentions are often good, right? There's this understanding that I think there was this ethical concern about, can we put a price on or a value on DNA? This is just this human or just natural part of the world. And so you can see how the ethics decisions, but what I think is so fascinating about the story you tell is that it doesn't, those decisions get made without understanding these broader, consequences. And the idea that we've created a system with these large, monopolistic big companies who are now, essentially able to take all of that, they don't have to pay for patents, as you said, and run this model constantly, is actually just such a dramatic unintended consequence, right? Like you've shipped out all the possibility for innovators within that world to actually be the sources of the development and put it all in the hands of this big, these powerful sort of single players who, you're going to get to in a moment, but I think where the limitations are within that for how new drugs are discovered. But I mean, I just maybe just reflect on that, right? Like how do we, is there anybody unpacking that decision and trying to say, you know what, this has put us in this terrible situation. Why don't we need to create a better incentive system for scientists to
yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, I honestly know that because I've worked in research for decades, and I work with the top scientists of the world for decades. I've always been fortunate from that regard, but what I'm seeing and my wife is still in the science research area, as you know her, Michael, but they really don't get a real true incentive for their work. There's nothing like an incentive to say you could discover something that could ultimately make you some money. I mean, let's be honest, that it helps, especially when you're paying academic salaries. It doesn't happen often that would happen, but just the mere idea of it happening is good enough. The possibility, right, is what scientists live for. You know, maybe it's possible. I was quoted once in Scientific, magazine. And I said, the science fiction principle that maybe it's possible has been with me all my life as a scientist. I mean, that is a true statement. Like, as long as there's a possibility for something, you go after it. But when you're really just, and that was probably a good decision at some level, but because it cascaded into this other effect that was not wanted, I don't think the science is good anymore. I don't think the science is good as it used to be, because I think kids see this and they go, why would I go into science? I can't become wealthy from coming up with a major discovery. I can just publish a paper. And so I think we've lost a lot of the drive. Of course, there's other things people can do these days that are much more exciting, right? But science was a big thing once, like that's what we really loved to do, and we did it really well. So how do we fix this? And so one of the ways that, I've been thinking about it, and please stop me when you want, but if you think of it in terms of what people actually want or need, well, the pandemic taught us very, very quickly what we needed. We needed therapeutics when this thing broke out, and we didn't have them, and we still don't have them. And that is just absolutely unacceptable to me as a scientist, because I know there are drugs that can benefit people and save their lives potentially. And it's sad to know that we're not really pursuing that because of economic reasons. And the scientists can be utilized in some capacity to, for example, help repurpose drugs. Like, I think of these things all the time to think I'm a scientist as well as a businessman now, but if I could make any money from a repurposed drug and I got scientists, which I know very well, to help me along that process with their unbelievable models they've created over many years, and pay them for that or give them a royalty back or something, I can bring back a way to incentivize them, to do better modeling or better animal studies or whatever it's going to be. And to me, that's something that's desperately needed in the field of science to sort of re-motivate people to do it, and share, like you're sharing all the benefit, you're distributing the benefit among everyone who's involved, not just that upper 0.01% big pharma company that basically makes all the profit and literally took, and I like to quote this, as it's a fact, you can look it up, it's $38 billion net, from vaccine for 1 year. And I don't think that's right. That's a large sum of money out of the DAO of the governments around the world, but it's a huge profit for one individual. So the ultimate centralization.
And it's also that sort of money, like government funding is so limited, its resources limited. It's ultimately therefore a zero-sum game, which means it's not money that's available for the development of therapeutics and others that you would have wanted to see developed, right? I mean, it's that whole trade-off problem that we face, and we put everything into vaccines and didn't think about these other ideas.
No, the therapeutics were never looked at significantly because they don't have the incentive. Like, I talk about incentive as being money. Right. It is an incentive, and pharma, of course, has that as a major incentive, but people really just want to live, right? They want to not die from the infection, and it's not the virus that kills you, it's the infection that kills you. And it's usually due to an inflammatory response, is what we discovered during the way on our way to finding these drugs, we uncovered this principle that was super important. And now it's agreed, I think, pretty universally that it's agreed upon that inflammation is the killer when you get infected, and we need to mitigate that. But that is not an area that big pharma will go after, because it's really not affecting the virus. It's affecting the cell that the virus has infected. And that's something they don't do.
If they could make money out of that, though, why wouldn't they be incentivized to go? I mean, I make more money out of a vaccine because it's such large scale usage, right? I suppose that's
very simple. It's really easy to make a vaccine, like simple, easy. Like you can make the RNA in my kitchen. But I'm being facetious, but you get the point. But making a molecule to a host factor you haven't even identified yet, and having that be safe, that would be a new drug, right? You'd have to go through this entire process. It would take 10 to 15 years, according to pharma, cost them billions of dollars. And at the end of the day, it's just too risky for them.
Got it.
What I did was found repurposed drugs that were already safe on the shelf, off patent, not worth anything to produce in that way. When you have 27 buildings on a campus, you cannot afford to make a repurposed drug for anyone, because it's just not going to be profitable enough. But for a small company that's highly efficient, it's highly profitable, potentially, very profitable. And that's the kind of profit I would love to share with a DAO, in a sense, share with a community.
So
you can make money.
Right? Because what I think you're getting at here is like, you need a different source of capital, right? If pharma are the only game in town, big pharma, they've got this model. It's all about big bang for your buck, blockbuster. They're going to not look at all these smaller things. It's not worth it. They're going to try to like maximize their 1 out of 10 thing you have, and that's their game. So just describe the DAO to us as a concept, as an alternative way to bring capital in to fund the development of avatar.
So I would never say I'm a DAO expert. I don't think anybody can say that, to be honest. I've heard people tell me that they're DAO experts. But in my mind, a DAO was brought to my attention about a year ago, 9 months after I wrote an article to myself, really, about how frustrated I was by the lack of capital available from either pharma or, for that, from government, actually, to, as you pointed out earlier, to do therapeutics. And so when I learned about blockchain, the thing that hit me right away was the old story of, imagine if I can get a penny from everybody on the planet, I could do something important, and nobody would ever care or miss a penny, because I find them on the street all the time. So blockchain just allowed that kind of to happen at scale, which I thought was really interesting. And even though people would tell me, oh, you got to have more governance and you have to, and I felt that, DAOs weren't companies. They were literally just wallets. So the way I thought of a DAO was a wallet with a purpose. That's how I thought about it. And I thought, if I could get a big enough purpose, it has to be a big purpose in my mind, like something that really changes things quite dramatically, like save humanity with repurposed drugs, for example. How would you do that and do it transparently and do it with, a steering committee or whatever, but have every one of it, anyone can join that DAO, anyone in the world. And that's a pretty powerful thought.
Yeah.
And I worked on that for a year, of course. And now I'm getting to a point where I think things are starting to come together, where I'm getting people excited, largely thanks to you guys in some ways, getting me out there. But the point is very simple. You either do, whatever it's going to be, NFTs or tokens, whatever, some structure that makes sense and works. I think NFTs are actually a good way to start. And you build, for example, collections of NFTs from maybe a famous artist or something who gets this and wants to help. And then as those NFTs are sold, that money goes into a treasury where someone is steering it, and it puts it to the community after they've decided that this looks like a really profitable possibility. It's not going to be billions like in pharma, but maybe we're going to, ultimately make a few $1 million from this. But more importantly, we're going to save a lot of lives. We're going to actually make a difference if the next pandemic hits. We're going to have therapeutics available in everybody's chest. And that's where I got excited. And I think if that message was to get out there and market it, if you lack of a better word, properly, with the right transparency, I'm already working with government a little bit, you do it under normal business practice, where you make a margin that's not absurd, that's reasonable, and you do the work that you spent 10 years of my life creating without, I have nothing against venture capitalists, but I did it without venture capital. So I actually am a unique position here to make this happen and bring back sustainability to a DAO by bringing back some of the profits to the DAO. But the thing I've been trying to say, and I try to say in New York, it's like, it's not about the individual's gain from the DAO. It's about the DAO being better. Like, you don't get a return on your taxes, right, to the government. You don't expect a return. You actually don't really expect to go in debt like we are, but that's what happens. But you don't really expect an individual gain from paying your taxes. So this is sort of a similar concept that you buy into a DAO, but it's really about building the government.
Let's I'm not going to use the word unpack now, because apparently I'm going to get taxed for saying that. But I think that's an interesting way to just to segue. I mean, we do need to talk a little bit about the structure of the DAO, because Kareem was talking about the 85-15 problem and governance.
Yes.
Yeah, but before we do, I mean, I just want to just make the observation of why, when you first outlined this idea to me when we met in Lisbon, why I was so energized around it, and what I think is at the heart of what you have the potential to tap into. I immediately thought of the fact that my sister had died of melanoma, 4 years ago, and how, for me, like, if I was to, the question was, would I put $100 into a project to explore a cure for melanoma, knowing that I might be able to actually generate through this model something far more aggressive and constructive than having to like wait on big pharma to come in. And I was like, oh God, yeah. Like, and I don't, I'm not expecting $100 anything on that return. All I want as a invested family member in that concern is that's my payoff, that's my profit, right? And I think just how many people around the world would think that way, which I think is an interesting way for you to think about, like you said, this, you don't expect a return from your government, your taxes, but you do expect these services, these needs that you have to be met. And the idea that I would see, the efficient search for a cure for melanoma or a treatment of melanoma or name any number of countless diseases for which people have lost loved ones for, we're all going to say, here's $100, Gennaro, go off and work this out. And I just think that's a very powerful idea. But with that in mind, how do we then figure out what the governance looks like? Like, what's your thinking? How does this potentially very large community of human beings, excited, passionate about whatever it is that you're doing, nonetheless, like, live up to the structure of a DAO so that it doesn't get captured? And like, the last thing you want to do is turn this DAO into yet another quote unquote decentralized version of a big pharma company, right? Like,
of course not.
Yeah. And so the structure and the governance is actually really important here. How have you been thinking about that?
Right. So the first thing I thought about was, I think I'm not giving our company enough credit. Actually, it's not me, but it's the group of people I have in my company, and you can look them up if you're interested at our website. But we invented a unique technology, a proprietary technology that allows the repurposing of drugs. And I think I should say that because that's the only reason, in my mind, I have the opportunity to try to build this. There's no doubt in anyone's mind in the pharmaceutical industry, and they won't tell you that necessarily, but I've talked to some very high level people in the field, repurposing of drugs works. Okay, it just works. And it might be done internally with drugs that are not off patent, but are still on patent potentially, but it didn't work for something and then they switched it over. I could think of many, like Viagra, for example. It happens, repurposing happens, and there's a reason it happens. And that's what we invented. Like many, many years ago, I thought about how it might work, that one drug might have a role in another disease through a module, and we figured out how to measure that. So I don't want to downplay the significance of that. That's amazing systematic technology that allows us to repurpose drugs, and we've proven that over the last few years that this can really be done. So that is really like a DNA sequencing machine or something, and we want to run that machine at scale. And that was how I first started my first company, which was non-for-profit, called Iomix. Didn't work out. So I went to a for-profit challenge, which worked reasonably well. So when you go to a DAO, I say this because a DAO can never do what GN did. I mean, collectively, we have 150 years of research experience in yeast biology, which has allowed us to develop this machine, if you will. That isn't going to happen overnight. It took 40 years, in essence, starting from Lee Hartwell, originally working on yeast for cell cycle and proving. Now there's 4 Nobel Prizes, 3 since he won it in 2001. This is an amazing system that we have knowledge of. So you can't expect a DAO to do that. What a DAO can do, literally, is fund that as an opportunity to save humanity. That's it. And because pharma won't do it, clearly, they don't have an interest in repurposing medications. And government is just bureaucratic, and we're like a supplement, if you will, to the government, in my opinion. It's like the government has too many things to do. It can't focus. It doesn't really do anything themselves. They don't want profit back. A DAO could get profit back to support the DAO, support the government. So the way I think about it is only work together with companies that have a very clear profit margin in what they're doing. It's not startups. We're not talking about, but venture capitalists can fund companies that have a good model for making profit. That's why I was talking about commodities, because to me, if I could figure out a drug that protects us from the next pandemic, and even if it's repurposed, I can get a manufacturing plant partner, which I already have. I got a clinical trial partner I already have. We can put together a system to develop that drug. It'll cost X amount of dollars, and we can project what it would make if we sold it to every government in the world. And maybe we'll make 10 million or 100 million or whatever we decide as a DAO. So the DAO has a steering committee of amazing people. In my mind, shouldn't be paid. They should be doing this because they're already amazingly successful in their world. They already make money, but they're doing this because they believe in this project. And it's not much to do other than say that profitable thing looks good on paper. It's like, we're a for-profit company. We're going to make $10 million on this deal. If we do it, we need, $2 million to get it done. And that's it. And it goes to a vote. It's not decided by the steering committee. It only is decided to go to a vote where everybody who's in the DAO can now vote. And yes, if somebody comes in with a whale-sized billion-dollar whatever, yeah, they're going to have more votes than anybody else. Maybe we'll taper it off. But the point is, who cares? Because he's not going to get an individual gain. He's just going to be like voting towards a disease of his interest or something, But he's going to say yes or no, and that's it. And majority rules. If the majority wants that project to work, it's funded, it gets done, and a percentage of those profits come back to the DAO. And that's it. So to me, it's a sustainable model because you can literally, if you pick the correct for-profit businesses that are making money and they just need to scale something, like I can't go to big pharma and say, I have a repurposed drug, I need to scale it. Would you help me? They'll laugh at me. They're never going to spend time with me doing that. But I can go to a nearly bankrupt manufacturing facility in the United States that's dying for a project and say, can you make me 10 billion doses of this? And I'll give you this much profit. And they'll take that job every day and they'll stay in business. This is a bigger story actually here.
Yeah. Just one thing though, when I think about the voting model you described, right? Like this is all to be TBD, right? We need to figure this out.
Yeah.
But
yes.
one of the topics that's very common in the crypto community is like, how do you stop people from gaming things, right?
Right.
And this is this whole debate about if you identity, like if you don't identify who the voters are, the participants, can you collude and form these groups? And Bitcoin actually solved this problem by forcing proof of work to prevent the capacity of what they call Sybil attacks, right? Multiple unidentified actors forging effectively a collective pile of power to come in. And I think about the way that money itself has infected our government, right? And so that you essentially can buy votes in an indirect way. So I'm not saying that your model you described is a bad one at all, but just to say that there's gonna have to be some very clear thinking about how that separation between the development of the drugs and the vote, because it's not as simple. If it's just a vote, that's a nice way to describe it. There's a whole lot of stuff that can happen in the background that can actually game the system and lead these things to models, right? So
you just gave me a great idea, Michael. I mean, literally you could get, if once you buy an NFT, you get one vote, but it doesn't matter how much money you put in. So if you put in $1 or $1 million, it's still one vote.
That might be, right? But it also might not be the way that you get enough clout and incentive or whatever. I don't know. But I think that the nice thing about your model,
I think the message is strong enough that you don't need to have that incentive of power tripping.
Right. I think the beauty of what you have is that people are not as incentivized by money because they're really incentivized by the results, right? And I think that's what's potentially powerful about it. I also think it's very interesting to think about how, whatever concerns may or might exist about securities laws in this, there's a there's a really strong case to talk to regulators and say, do you really want to kill this, right? This opportunity now to actually fast track the discovery of drugs for pandemic preparedness and so forth. But Kareem, you suddenly appeared on the screen. Did you want to come in and ask a question? I see that there's a panel question up there for people. But did you want to drop? I don't know what time we're supposed to wind this up.
There are always two reasons I show up, either for letting you know that time's up, or I have a question. In this case, both. But you already you stepped ahead of that question about the governance of the DAO and gaming the system. So that question no longer exists. But I wanted to thank you. I mean, we haven't explored enough yet. I think this is a good path to go down. Obviously, the governance and the creation and the funding of it, and governed by the people for the people sort of thing, with the steering committee. But it doesn't have to look like a foundation, nor does it have to look like a not-for-profit, because those systems are generally challenged anyway. But you've just got a few more minutes.
Okay. I want to have a follow-up to what Michael was just saying, because it was a good lead into something that I think is really important. Credibility is super important in this case, right? And I've lived my whole life trying to build my credibility in the space of science as well as in business. Government, we all want government to kind of get their act together. I heard it in the last discussion. We want some type of regulation and blockchain to be realized for its true potential, which I think is enormous. I'm working with government, so I'm like your best shot at getting them to listen, because I would argue we have one of the best utilities for blockchain in the world right now. And I hope there'll be others that also verge with the DAO and build, and the venture capitalists can help because they can fund the companies that become for-profit entities that can basically be fueled by DAOs, and all you have to give up is a little bit of royalty. So it makes a lot of sense for the venture capitalists in the crowd to think about that. But in the same token, I have talked to government officials about DAOs, and I'm getting them to listen to me because of the credibility that Lee Hartwell, myself have in science. And Lee is incredible. He's 83 years old, but he's sharp as a tack. And he got blockchain immediately because he's a smart man, and he loved the distribution of it. So little by little, I'm spoon feeding this to like the chief medical officer of HHS, and they're receptive, I would say. And we just need to do it right and put it in the context where it's a supplement to their efforts to save lives. And I think they just don't know what to do most of the time. So this is providing them a way to get into blockchain potentially, just to get to understand it as a help to them, because that's what they really are, a centralized organization that is supposed to save lives and do good things. But DAOs can take a really important step, I think, in bringing even scientists that don't believe blockchain's for real, I know many, could actually begin to learn that this is not what they thought, that this actually has a purpose and can really change things for them as well. That's what I think. That's my hope anyway.
Yeah, I think one of the messages of the FTX debacle for me has been that we need this industry to turn its attention on actual real world practical, value use cases, as opposed to number go up, right?
Yes.
The market signals, unfortunately, of the last number of years have been to incentivize people to build essentially exchanges of trading tokens as quickly and fastly as possible. And ultimately, what you're talking about is something with a very practical benefit. And I think that's really interesting. I also just noted Corey Himmel's comment here. I think it's very interesting. That saying one thing to note when thinking about DAOs, you shouldn't look at backwardly applying a DAO model to a traditional business that doesn't work. Instead, look at DAOs as a new way to form businesses in the future that challenge the status quo of organizational hierarchy. I think that's kind of where you're at, right? I mean, because
not exactly, because I'm a true believer in founder-led companies. I'm just sorry, the best.
No, I don't think that, but I think that one is like the business,
yeah.
but it's forming or funding. I think I just changed the word funding.
Funding would be more accurate.
But you are creating
there I would agree.
a challenge to the hierarchy of pharma, right? It's whether or not it's the business or the actual industry that you're trying to create a challenge to. I think that's where, like, it's not like you're trying to say, hey, let's restructure big pharma around a DAO. You're literally treating an alternative source.
Yeah, big pharma has a great business model for big pharma. Let's face it, it works. But what I'm talking about, and this is a good thing to mention, of course, is one very wealthy person, Mark Cuban, is out there trying to distribute drugs. And what I'm talking about is building an ecosystem. I'm talking about having not just discovery where I lie, but also we have to have clinical trials. And I found very efficient companies that do that in Brazil, in Africa, and they're good companies. And they had successful trials during the pandemic. One of the drugs we found, actually. And then you have manufacturing facilities that need a lifeline. They need to be utilized. This is a big topic apparently in San Francisco right now on DOD. Everyone's screaming, we need our own drugs. We need to make our own drugs on our own soil. Well, I happen to know there's manufacturing facilities that are getting squeezed out of the market by basically the big operators. So that's a problem, right? And then the other thing is distribution, where Mark Cuban is stepping up and saying, hey, let's distribute drugs at a cost that's affordable to people. But what we need is a brand. We need a US made drug. We need branding, and we need repurposing of old existing drugs that can be manufactured in these facilities and brought to market. That's what I'm talking about, is an ecosystem. So I'm only part of that. And all these players should get a margin, they should get their profits, and we should share those profits with a DAO that funds it and gets it done. That's it. It's that sort of simple, but it's not, of course, but we'll get there. I think we'll get there.
Thank you, Gennaro. Michael,